Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's edition of the Sunday Shot. And here, as ever, a week off last week, Dave, but welcome back
Thanks
to
for
the
having me back,
co-hosting
Joe.
role.
Nice to have a sleep in.
It was, even though you wasted that extra hour of daylight saving.
I mean, you call it wasted. I think I used it productively.
We are joined today Anthony Klan is back this week after our disastrous technical glitch plagued first episode that saw Anthony take an early exit, unfortunately, due to glitchy internet. But Anthony from the Klaxon, we are delighted to have you back on the Sunday Shot.
Thank you. Great to be here. I think hopefully we've got all things working this time around.
I think so. And we are also joined by an expert on that nefarious great right wing conspiracy that is taking place all over the world that we're going to hear a lot about, the Atlas Network, Lucy Hamilton.
Hi, everyone.
Welcome to the Sunday Shot.
Thank you.
Now, I think we're going to dive into the world of mis and disinformation and these sort of narratives that have been deliberately created to confuse, distract, and deceive us. But given that we are an election campaign, I mean, the major parties themselves continue, and their various supporters in the media continue to assert some well-established but entirely unproven and often sometimes fundamentally debunked political tropes that are then elevated and amplified. Coalition is lower taxing, lower spending, better managers of the economy, that sort of thing. Dave, you've been compiling a list of some of your favourite tropes of this nature.
Well, I don't know if they're my favourite, but I'm just a way of phrasing it. But I did think it's worth pointing out because basically what we're talking about this discussion is bullshit. We're talking about weaponized bullshit. And in Australia, we have these long established myths that once upon a time someone said something, and then because our press pack, very lazy, semi unintelligent, just repeat it over and over again. And then 30 years later, we accept these things as truisms. We base the rest of the conversation around them. But that has poisoned the conversation to begin with because we're starting from a place of bullshit. So Joe's just mentioned the fact that we basically uncritically accept without thinking that the Liberal Party are better economic managers. This isn't. Serious people don't think this is true, but journalists do. This it goes back to Liberal Party propaganda, but it was sort of widely accepted around the Howard Costello mining boom era. That's when the public just went, okay, this is probably a thing. We'll go with this. I want to give you an example from the other side of the fence, though, too, because something that's important is that we are far better at seeing bullshit when it doesn't align with our political beliefs. We have a harder time of seeing it from our own side of the fence. So a Labor Party myth of that is that they have a more humane refugee policy than the Liberal Party. This isn't something you hear in the press that often because that's not what the press likes to do, but you do hear it from progressive voters in these circles. It's sort of a mainstream accepted fact, and that also is as bullshit as the Liberal Party being better on the economy. It's some of the most inhumane things have been done under Labor governments. And then another example that crosses the whole spectrum is a duopoly myth that minority governments don't ever work. There's a very good reason why we keep hearing this, but it's also not true. The Gillard government was a minority government. They passed more legislation than any government in recent history. Also, every Liberal Party government is a minority government.
Yeah.
That kind of works against the point I'm making because I don't think they work that well. But it is yet again another myth that we just decide is true. So that's the landscape. And then on top of that, we have insidious actors that we're going to get into with Anthony and Lucy right now.
We do. And I think what is jaw-dropping is that when you dive into these insidious actors is you start to get a sense of just how widespread they are, how deeply they are embedded within Western democracies. And when Hillary Clinton talked all those years ago about a vast right-wing conspiracy being out to get her and Bill, it actually was true. You've got this toxic combination of money, business interests, and extremist ideologies amplified by and agenda-fueled media, and particularly certain sections of the media, which are propagating a lot of very ideologically, commercially driven interests, but pretending that they are coming up from broad grassroots democratic organisations. So, Lucy, you have done an enormous amount of research into this. I wonder if you can set the scene for us and go back and tell us about the origins of some of this, and particularly the Atlas Network and what that is, where it came from, and how widespread its influence now is.
Sure. So the Atlas Network was founded in 1981, but the movement of business to try and control democracy had started closer to the beginning of the 1900, leading into the First World War. So a bunch of businessmen were really annoyed. And if you think about the current election in this context, it's helpful. We're really annoyed that workers were unionising and that too many of the riffraff had the vote now. And so they wanted to be able to manage that so that those kinds of people didn't get in their way. And so in the First World War, they saw how incredibly effective in America propaganda was to turn people who didn't want to go to war in Europe into sending their sons and a lot of money into that process. And so when the war ended, they took them into the business world and they used it to help break strikes. And so what business worked out at that point is that if they manipulated the public to oppose the strikers, then they didn't have to use machine guns, they didn't have to use tear gas, and they were actually much more popular at the other end of it, and they beat the strikes. So in the Second World War, they had some Labour governments coming in and a lot of government action in the economy, which they really hated. So in 1943, with the Labour government in Australia, Rupert Murdoch's dad and a bunch of his business friends set up the first of these think tanks in Australia called the Institute of Public Affairs, or the IPA. And so on and off through the second half of the century, the Cold War, they fought communism with this business propaganda. And in the 70s, in Australia in particular, they started bringing out some of the key figures from the American scene and the British scene, where it had been, pretty much equally popular, to educate Australian businessmen how to fix our problem with Labor governments like Whitlam and with striking workers, and to turn our economy and our political economy into something much more suitable for business. So, as little tax as possible and as little regulation. So at that stage, you had the Centre for Independent Studies and, the H.R. Nichols Society being set up by people who, many of them ended up in the Liberal Party. And Nichols was supposed to break unions. Centre for Independent Studies was supposed to produce academic and research things. So their job was to speak to politicians and to high-ranking people who had the power to change things and to make them believe that this political economy that was coming out of America, that we now dismissively refer to as trickle-down economics, was the only sustainable economic model for that moment. And so one strain of it is to do that. Another strain is to set up institutes in universities, because tycoons and their foundations were really happy to throw money at setting up these sort of bodies, either in universities or as fake policy research bodies, or increasingly things that we now call astroturf, which are fake grassroots, but things that are populist right, trying to convince the public that all these policies that are actually geared towards making really rich people much richer are working in their interests. So either by telling them that free enterprise is a patriotic value, or by distracting them. So there's a book called Merchants of Doubt, which shows how these think tanks with a handful of co-opted scientists worked really hard to make everyone believe that tobacco wasn't dangerous, even when they knew it was killing people. That all sorts of DDT, all that sort of stuff was bad for them. And so in Australia in America in 81, they set up together as the Atlas Network, and then they coordinated much more effectively and sent them out into the world. And so they were controlling, people who were trying to get out of empire. They were controlling local governments to try and make sure that they didn't get away in the way of international miners. So they'd get local donors and local people, often, you know, from the equivalent of the private schools who wanted to protect their interests, to come in and fight the battle, partly for American corporations, but partly also for local. Is that enough?
Yeah, no, I mean, so effectively, it's a very deliberate strategy of rich, often corporations and the individuals who run them, who set up these different interlocking networks. So there's the term junk tank, which I was fascinated to read. So it's instead of it's think tanks, but who have a political and a corporate agenda that they are hiding. I mean, this is the thing; it's all clandestine. So they are then reinforcing the institutes within universities. They are setting up fake organisations, what we now describe as AstroTurf, pretending they're grassroots. They have captured politicians, and then they are amplified by their friends within the media. And it is a very carefully coordinated strategy that began in the US and has now been being exported from the US and imported into countries like Australia.
Yeah.
And can I just add, from a working journalist's perspective, why this is kind of fewer resources, tighter deadlines, less expertise and knowledge. We're kind of doing comms degrees instead of philosophy and history degrees. And then we get a phone call from some whack job in some office in South Yarra with a fancy, you know, Institute of Public Affairs. It makes it sound like it's, you know, it's got some gravitas, where it's actually just right-wing ideologues trying to funnel bullshit down your throat. And you're the journalist on the other end of that phone. You're like, I've got a story now. Off it goes, you know?
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about the Mont Pelerin Society, which you now describe as effectively the steering committee for the Atlas Network, and how the Atlas Network got its tentacles into Australia, and who are the key players within it? Some familiar names.
Sure. So the Mont Pelerin Society first met in 1947, and you know, by some accounts, it's the beginning of neoliberalism. And it was a bunch of economists, the Austrian school economists, so Friedrich Hayek, von Mises, people who were really into, you know, hardcore politics for the rich, economics for the rich, basically, together with a bunch of academics. And they fostered the Chicago school becoming more radical. And so it sort of worked its way out of there. There were Australian economists in there, I think, from the second meeting of it. So it's certainly been influencing Australia from the get-go. But you'll find a lot of different Australian people there. So some of them are academics. John Howard ended up there. Tim Wilson is there. Janet Albrechtsen was reported there. We don't often get the membership logs, so we have to take what we can get. The last two were around about 2013 that we have. Morris Newman.
Morris Newman, we'll put a little flag by, because he pops up all over the place.
Indeed. So often it'll be the people who head up different think tanks who end up being on the Mont Pelerin Society, but there's a bunch of them. And if you look at Mancal, which is the West Australian Atlas Network one, they have a lot of different reports on their site from all the different places that they're sending students to, including Mont Pelerin Society meetings. And the students' descriptions of them show you the kind of people who are there. So leading media figures, mining magnates, leading, you know, economists, that sort of thing. So they're really an important networking element. And indeed, the Saturday paper had a report from Mike Seckham about how the IPA had been, you know, more in the Australian model of economic rationalism until some of its leading figures went off to the Mont Pelerin Society meeting in Hong Kong and came back enthused and ready to turn it into the very radical body it is now.
Gosh. And clearly there's a very strong agenda which is about advancing financial interests, particularly, but it's done in a variety of different ways, and sometimes that is by waging culture wars, which are mostly about sort of distracting And Anthony, you had some observations about this because they play these culture war games, keeping everybody busy and fighting ideological battles, but it doesn't cost any of the businesses anything, so they can get on making their money over here whilst there is this sort of distracting war going on over here and keeping everyone busy.
Exactly, and so this whole culture war thing. I mean, for example, it's a cheap way of getting influence and keeping people tied up. So you've got the big banks ripping people off. You've got fossil fuels spreading disinformation. You've got vested interests running rampant. And yet all these issues, if you were to shine the light on them, as some newspapers do, but a lot of them don't because they're too busy tied up running this culture wars nonsense about trans bathrooms or some ridiculous thing, getting all the public riled up to scream at each other so they're not looking at who's ripping them off or who's doing the wrong thing, all the traditional things that people expect media to be doing. So it's this fabricated nonsense. I mean, if you look up the tree, you've got this culture war going on. It's not costing anyone anything. As you mentioned, it's not costing anyone. So if you're looking at bank corruption, and you're stamping that out, that's costing the banks because they're no longer allowed to engage in corruption. So if you look up the tree, who's running it, it's vested interests. So I think that is a lot of the culture war issue. It's also a good way of detaching people from reality. If you want people to believe your nonsense, you get them all riled up emotionally. It's a psychological thing. People are riled up emotionally, and then you go, hey, by the way, global warming is bullshit or whatever your message is. But that's a lot of it. So that's why you see a lot of the sort of anti-vax and the climate deniers, and they're sort of tied right into this culture war thing because it's a great vector for getting people, to take over whatever vested interests you're pushing down their throats.
Well, I think that's a great point, Anthony. I just want to re-emphasize that because we miss the psychological element of this a lot when we're looking at the way the media works. I mean, Orwell talked about this stuff as well. You keep people hungry, you keep people angry, you keep people confused, and you are just inherently more susceptible to believing nonsense. It's a fact. It's how we work.
And I think it's interesting mentioning COVID and anti-vaxxing because the Atlas Network was onto the potential of COVID as a tool to, turn people against government, tyranny is coming type thing.
100%. And so was some of the News Corp, for example, and this has happened at the time. You could see it. So you had this, which was sort of this right left thing is largely nonsense, but typically this sort of hesitancy vaccine sort of thing wasn't an area for the hard right, but they sort of co-opted it. And I guess part of it's thinking, well, if you're willing to believe that, then what else can we sell you? So they sort of grabbed onto it. And I guess in the States, you obviously had Fox News spreading huge amounts of lies. A lot of people died about masks, etc. Republicans far less likely to believe in vaccines and to use masks. And in Australia, we had the same thing with Sky News, and they were running the same nonsense. They know it's a lie. It's clearly a lie. But they're running it anyway, to the point where Google suspended Sky News for 2 weeks. And the first time ever, YouTube just suspended them. See you later. And if they did it again, they were cancelled for good. Now, obviously, they would have spent a lot of money behind the scenes to try and patch things up. But I mean, that's really bad till you get to that level. And that's exactly what they're doing. And you've got that media, that large section of media operating as a backboard to support all the rest of this nonsense. Like, it sort of legitimizes it in people's minds. And so you go, look at that. Oh, it must be real. That big news organization is giving me a backboard. And then beyond that, you go into full crazy town. And that's where the interests are, is getting people to vote against their own interests, act against their own interests. And there's a lot of money to be made from that. And that's why they're doing it.
I mean, I think the whole kind of radicalizing through the COVID lockdowns and was also undermining the veracity of science, which of course is then useful when it comes over to things like climate denying. But also it was very much, again, about business interests. And the Koch brothers, who seem to just be all over this all the time, I think, owning one of the largest private fossil fuel kind of businesses in the world. But a lot of that was also about, businesses were suffering during lockdowns and for people working from home and all those kinds of things. So again, it's a very clear agenda of protecting business interest with no regard for public good, Lucy.
Yeah, exactly. So Walker Bragman's been doing good research on the Koch investment in working against COVID measures. So
yeah, I mean, they just seem to be kind of everywhere. And then I guess the Atlas Network, can you just, before we go to our interview, it would be useful if you could, Lucy, to perhaps just run through some of the organisations that are now here in Australia, which are actually fronts or part of the Atlas network, despite their neutral and democratic sounding names?
So the Institute of Public Affairs, the Centre for Independent Studies, Mancal, Liberty Works, which is the body behind CPAC Australia. So you've also got the Libertarian Society and the Taxpayers Alliance. So there's a few more. Oh, and HR Nichols is back. So some of them are re-emerging at the moment. So they'd been dormant for a while. And so I think with the new kind of labour movement getting a bit more traction with governments, the HR Nichols is back to try and make sure that unions don't get anywhere in Australia.
And just to reinforce, and then I'll get Dave to introduce our interview for this week, but the extent of the power of these organisations in America, it is the Federalist Society, it's the Heritage Foundation who are behind Project 2025. So all of the things that we now see wreaking such havoc on America's democracy had their genesis in strategy, deliberately and over a long term, developed by the Atlas Network.
That's right. And the Christian right element is very clear at the moment in the American body. So the Heritage Foundation is part of two networks. It's part of the Atlas Network, and it's also part of the Council for National Policy, which is the Christian nationalist and libertarian thing that founded in the same year as the Atlas Network. And so the head of Heritage is an extreme Catholic, and you have an extreme Catholic in Leonard Leo, who's the Federalist Society, who's filled the Supreme Court in America with extremist Catholics and similar religions. So it's taking over there, and it's also interconnected here.
And so just on that point briefly, there is this sort of dual agenda, and they can be complementary, where you've got business people who are essentially about just protecting their business interests and out to make more money. But then you have this Christian, like extreme Christian kind of ideology, which is actually about beliefs and ideology more than necessarily only money.
Yeah, that's right. And so you've got people funding the American end of Atlas who are extremely hardcore Christian in the sense that they're coercive. They don't want anyone to be anything but straight, heterosexual, married, and reproductive sex. So they're coming after all the reproductive healthcare options. They want women back in the home primarily. The idea of the new Save bill is to block a lot of women voting, and it's an easy way into the idea that women shouldn't vote, that only the father should vote for the family. So there's some really incredibly extreme stuff, and a lot of the plutocrats that fund the Atlas Network seem to genuinely believe it, aside from the ones who are much more instrumental about using religion.
And just on that SAVE issue, so that is this sort of new voting acts coming through that has already passed Congress and is now going up to the Senate, which says that you have to have ID to show before you can vote. And if you don't happen to have a passport or a driver's license or something, then the message is, oh, well, you can bring your birth certificate, but if you're a married woman and your birth certificate does not match your name and you don't have another form of ID, then essentially you will be disenfranchised because you will not be allowed to vote on election day. So yeah, it's really, it's terrifying stuff. And part of the terror is just how well organised and deeply entrenched these organisations are. And the consequences are very real. And Dave, this week you talked to Jackie Turner from the Trans Justice Project, who really was able to bring it home quite what the impact is of these sorts of things on our fellow Australians.
Yeah, I think it's important to talk to people that are at the other end of the victims of this sort of stuff to make it more real. Because, I mean, just listening to this conversation now, there is so much nonsense out there that when people like the four of us talk about it, it sounds like a Dan Brown novel, you know? We sound as crazy as the fucking anti-vaxxers do, even though we are talking about material things that are based on facts. We've got really good investigative journalists and academics here. but we sound nuts because it is crazy shit. So anyway, I spoke to Jackie, who represents the Trans Justice Project, and she had some interesting things to say about what it's like being on the end of this sort of stuff.
Okay.
We're joined by Jackie Turner, the director of the Trans Justice Project. Jackie, thanks for joining us on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
It seems a troubling time to be a trans person. We, to put it mildly,
Yeah.
a fantastic time.
Yeah.
We, under this new world order that we're seeing with authoritarian right, we're seeing social hierarchies form very deliberately, and trans people seem to be placed right down the bottom of that scale alongside Palestinians, basically. Very simply, what's it like being a trans person right now in this climate?
Yeah, look, it's to live in interesting times, right? I a little bit on Trans Day visibility when it passed on March 31st about the sort of duality of things at the moment, where I think it's more important than ever for us to be speaking out and standing up and being vocal about like our right to live good lives and have the freedom to be ourselves, but also that this comes at a time with in some ways unprecedented risk. Obviously, we're seeing in the US the repealing of the rights and protections of our community. We're seeing many politicians in Australia at the moment target our communities' rights and healthcare and our sense of safety in our communities. Yeah, just a really important time that people are actually getting organised and starting to think about how we build a better society, not just obviously for trans and gender diverse people, but for all of us, because obviously the sort of rise of the far right poses such an existential threat to so many of the communities that we're a part of.
It seems to me that whenever there is a need to not talk about the fact that the planet is cooking and that we are being fleeced by billionaires, trans people get brought up in a culture war stoush, whether it's, I don't know, sport or bathrooms or whatever it's about. Is that the sentiment that trans people feel around some of these
Oh, yeah, definitely. A lot of the community is painfully aware that we're being used as a political wedge at the moment. It's being used by cynical politicians who want to win and hold on to power, rather than any concern for our community, the well-being of trans youth, or the well-being of other people in our communities. It's so bizarre, right? Because at the same time, obviously people are really struggling. There's a huge, cost of living crisis. People are struggling with housing, and a lot of really serious issues. But instead, they're sort of having these debates about, what pronouns people use.
I mean, like all scare campaigns, it is just massively blown out of the water of how big a problem. And then we spend the vast amount of our time talking about this instead of myriad other things that are more important. It must be, I don't know, it must be scary.
Yeah, look, it's definitely a scary time. I think, especially seeing that, we're seeing billionaires like Clive Palmer choose to spend his millions and millions of dollars on ads about trans people, among a whole range of other things, and Gina Reinhart coming in. It's pretty surreal. I think that people like Gina Reinhart and Clive Palmer probably weren't even aware of the existence of people like me a couple of years ago. And now they're taking out full page ads in the Herald. It's bizarre and and pretty scary. Obviously, like a lot of the biggest companies in the world right now are taking big backward steps. Like we've just seen that YouTube has changed their hate speech laws so that gender identity is no longer included in them. And when we think about Meta, YouTube, like Twitter, like all of these massive companies, some of the biggest companies in the world, are basically saying that our community doesn't matter anymore and that they don't need to protect us and don't have a responsibility to ensure our well-being on their platforms. That's a pretty dystopian statement.
While we're talking about Clive Palmer's ads, I'd just like to say that the newspapers that are accepting these ads, knowing that it's hateful rhetoric, they don't actually have to do that. They're making conscious choices as well. what are the biggest pieces of misinformation that are weaponized against the trans community? Because that's what we're talking about this week on the show. Political misinformation.
Yeah, so I've done a bunch of work around mis and disinformation, and I think one of the things that we've really focused on is around these really coordinated campaigns around trans healthcare. So people have probably seen in the media, discussions about the puberty blocker and hormone ban in Queensland that's come into effect earlier this year. And I think that many people don't understand like where this has kind of come from. Like I have conversations with people wondering like, oh, why is this such a big issue? And I think it's really important for people to realize that this is part of a really coordinated campaign. In the trans community in particular, we've actually seen a really strategic, essentially like astroturfing of medical groups that pose as if they are experts on trans people's healthcare, but are actually sort of anti-trans groups in disguise. So since like 2019, there's been at least 20 of them that have started up globally. They produce bunk reports and research, and then get in their own sort of experts, and then try and infiltrate legitimate medical bodies. And so that's how we're seeing all of this stuff come out that looks really like it should be really reputable, but is actually deeply harmful to our community and really has the ultimate aim of denying us access to care, and denying, undermining our other sort of rights and freedoms. So with the stuff about puberty blockers, all of the sort of talking points that the Queensland government is using is really straight out of the playbook of a lot of these organisations and the campaign that they've been building since at least 2019. So it's quite scary to see that crossover. But I think what we know of our community are really focusing on, obviously, the stuff around healthcare, but also there was a big campaign around trans people in sport, and which flares up every so often, despite there being very few trans athletes, and actually no big studies on elite trans athletes. There's very little science about what that level of performance looks like. And so like these issues are kind of conflated and used as culture war material so that people can control the debate and, find a minority to blame so that they can win power, basically.
When we're talking about trans people in sport or any trans conversation, I find the discussion is quite gross when you unpack it, because what we're actually doing is using sport as a proxy to talk about the legitimacy of trans people existing in society, really.
Yeah, totally. That's totally right. And I think it's one of the reasons why people like J.K. Rowling really love talking about trans people in sport, because it means that they can talk about people's bodies. So she wants to be able to have, I should say people like her really want to be able to talk about essentially how much they dislike trans people aesthetically. It doesn't, we don't conform with their idea of what an attractive person is, I guess. And they want to be able to say that, but currently the only way they've managed to make that socially acceptable is for them to talk about it in terms of sport. But you see this same misogynistic language that for decades has been thrown at cis women athletes, and then lesbian athletes after them, and like Black athletes as well. These tropes about like what a woman should look like, how they should conform to certain beauty standards, like what level of femininity is appropriate and acceptable for women in public life. It's these same things just being trotted out over and over again.
Where these misinformation and disinformation groups, who are they? Where are they coming from? Where is the money coming from?
I would love to know where the money is coming from. That is a great question. We know that two of the big ones that I've written about before is GenSpect, and another one is called Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine.
Jesus, that's a loaded name.
No, it is, and it's a real like classic of these kinds of organizations, right? Like there's a ex-gay group in the US who does, I think in the past they used to be like a conversion practices group or something. called the Alliance Defending Freedom. You know, it's like they give themselves official sounding names, despite not being recognised medical bodies. They don't have relationships with the trans community. They don't have trans people involved in their organisations, even though they're writing almost exclusively about trans and gender diverse people in our healthcare. And they basically don't accept the core things about our community that we know when it comes to healthcare regarding, you know, how much access to gender affirming care, so like hormones and puberty blockers or like counselling, how much that improves people's lives and how life-saving that can be. And also that actually the overwhelming majority of people who are able to access trans healthcare thrive and, you know, find it that it actually like improves their life immensely. A huge study was done just, I think, 2 years ago. The US Trans Survey had over 93,000 participants in the survey. And I think it came back that 97% of those said that having access to gender affirming care improved their life, either a little bit or a lot. You know, that is a huge slice of the population of our community that is just like saying that this is actually really important for them to be able to live a good life and have the freedom to be themselves.
I mean, not only is it huge, it's atypical when you look at almost any other type of medical treatment or mental health treatment. You don't get 97% success rates.
I looked it up at one point out of curiosity, and something like 12% of people regret getting married, but we don't stop people getting married or like having kids or any of these other big life-changing decisions. We actually trust people to make informed decisions based on good information and what they believe is best for them.
If you could speak to every well-meaning, kind-hearted person that basically wants the best for every human on the planet, but they are confused by this issue and don't really understand it, what would you say?
And people want the same things as everyone else. You know, we want to feel safe in our communities. We want to be able to build good lives for ourselves. You know, we want to be protected from discrimination and be able to have the freedom to be ourselves. And there are people out there who are trying to take that away from us. And I think before you believe things about our community, it's really important to actually engage with us. There's plenty of resources out there to learn more about us. But I think the big thing at the moment is that our community is under attack, and we really need allies to be stepping up, to be learning themselves, but also speaking out in their communities and families and to their friends and everything to help educate them about our community as well.
Education and solidarity and allyship is extremely important, especially given that the world's richest, most powerful man that owns the world's largest brainwashing machine, X, is extremely anti-trans.
Yeah.
What's your take on Elon Musk's influence on
My
this?
take on Elon Musk, yeah. Not a day goes by where we don't talk about Elon Musk. I think we could talk about what is happening in America for days, right? But I think what is fascinating is the merger of state and corporate power that is happening in the US and the systematic destruction of democracy. When Naomi Klein released a book, I think last year, called Doppelganger, and in it she talks about like the basis of societies and like the democratic societies is that we can agree on some observable facts and truth, right? And I think one of the things that's really concerning about the sort of confluence of Meta, Musk, Trump is that we're losing, we've already lost, you know, our sort of public town squares and public spaces where we can express ourselves and connect. Those have been privatized. And now we're also losing the ability to agree on what things have actually happened in the world and what things are actually true. Like we actually can't, are losing our ability to have conversations grounded in facts and reality, which I think is, deeply concerning for those of us who want to live in a democracy.
I'm deeply concerned about the things you have just mentioned about an inability to not only share the same reality, but to just clock that this is even happening. It's so all-encompassing, the narrative structures that are created for us with the mainstream media, with social media, with the way our politicians talk. I think we're in trouble. I'd like to know what you think.
Yeah, look, it's not good. I think anyone's guess about the future is probably as good as mine right now. It seems like I'm learning more about how the world is interconnected and the way it works every day as Trump announces more things. I think what I am trying to focus on at the moment is the things that we know have always served us well, which is actually working to build movements, working to build power in our communities, building genuine relationships, training people, building leadership, and building people's understanding of how power works, so that we can actually steer this ship in a direction that's going to be better for all of us.
Jackie, thank you very much for your time and for your work.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, very informative interview there, which really runs through many of the same sort of strategies. Neutral sounding organisations set up, they create bunk reports that are then amplified by allies within the media. And that is very much happening here in Australia. So we might move on to some very specific examples to complement what Jackie had to say about the way that the trans community have been co-opted into the culture wars. And here, I guess, it is been particularly around climate, and that's manifest itself in lots of different ways, and First Nations issues as well. And we saw a lot of that, particularly around the voice referendum. So, Anthony, you've done a lot of work into demonstrating how what Advance, which is kind of the propaganda arm of the Liberal Party, claims independence but is actually funded by organisations like the Cormac Foundation, how they have been advancing big picture, small p political agendas, pretending, again, that they're grassroots organisations and have broad support.
Yeah, and as a starting point, looking into Advance, and it was I started looking into it just ahead of the Voice to Parliament referendum in October 2023. Sort of left it a bit late. I was expecting the other parts of the media would look into who the No outfit is, given this is the huge debate, right? So who is this No
Sweet
outfit?
summer child, Anthony. Why did you expect that?
I don't know. I had a million other things going on. I thought it would happen sooner or later. And then about 3 days out, I thought, gee, it's not happening. So I started looking into it. And, of course, there we go. It's all vested interest. That's where the lies are coming from, funnily enough. So, I ran an investigation on it, but it was too late to inform many people making their votes. But there you go. But anyway, it's such an important matter. And I figured they're going to be continuing this operation, particularly since it was so successful. Continued looking into it because it was obviously going to be a big issue in this coming election and going forward. Just for the audience, just looking into this Advance outfit, it became apparent almost straight away. I mean, a couple of other publications had actually looked at this, to be fair, but not in any enormous amount of detail. But it's basically a handful of mega millionaires, a billionaire and a handful of mega millionaires. That was all it boiled down to. Obviously, they're getting people to donate individually, members of the public. So they get members of the public riled up, culture war business, they're all stealing your jobs, whatever works, whatever their analysis tells them. So they're running polling, right, these sort of organizations. They're finding what triggers people, using that, whatever it is, using that to rile them up, tell them a bunch of nonsense, and then, try and raise some money out of them. So that brings there's two benefits to this. Let me rewind slightly because I've looked into it just yesterday, looking at this Australians for Prosperity outfit that came up in the media this week. The ABC's done some great work on it, and they've looked into it, and it's just another dark money outfit. It's funded by the coal industry, and it's out there, claiming to be a grassroots movement, and it's totally not. They're liars, essentially. So it's the same sort of model where they'll pretend they're an organic outfit, but they'll set up with a bunch of directors, set up a schmick website, and then put up a bunch of things trying to get people riled up. Then they'll have a little enter your email here for our newsletter, or they'll have these sort of sham votes or surveys, and they'll sort of use all of that just to harvest information. And then they'll then pretend that they're grassroots because some people are putting in $5, $10, $20 because they think, hey. So they sort of, it's the whole thing's fake, but it's exactly what Advance has been doing for years. Obviously, the Voice gave it a lot more power, and now it sort of considers itself to be quite a player, and it is. I mean, we saw what happened with The Voice, and they came out and claimed victory. They said, look what happened. Without us, this wouldn't have happened. And I believe that's true to a large extent, because before they started their disinformation campaign, The Voice was overwhelmingly Australians were in favour of it, and then it just fell off a cliff. And it's exactly in line with Advance's propaganda. So it's very effective. It's run by vested interests. I think a good way to describe what these groups are is they're sort of secret vested interest lobby groups. So if you're a vested interest, you're a fossil fuel industry, you're not going to come out and say, hey, fossil fuels are great. So you set up you funnel money to these sham operations, and they convince people to vote against their own interests or the interests of the future. And it is a psychological operation. It's telling people whatever they've worked out that gets people riled up, they'll tell them. I mean, for example, I've done an investigation, and it's ongoing, into the dark money, the impacts of dark money on environment. And so looking at these groups from a perspective of, where the fossil fuels money is coming from, following it through. So I've sort of done a road trip all down the East Coast, down through Newcastle, Wollongong, down through Victoria, and just sort of looking into this on the ground, and it's just remarkable. But a lot of these operations that claim to have tens of thousands of members, they're just a handful of people. There's probably about 6 people, 7 people, 8 people, and they're surrounded by about 40 or 50 people who they've conned into it. But I mean, and this is coming up in the piece, but in the car park we had sort of this, it's killed renewables kill whales and offshore wind kills whales. In the car park you got 5 or 6 cars, Audis, Range Rovers, sort of thing. The sticker on the back. One of them was actually stuck on there in sticky tape, so it's a temporary thing. And then the rest of the cars are sort of working class sort of people that have just been brought along into it. And it was in a working class area, a working class pub. I'm not to say anything's not having any difference or anything to say about whether someone's working class or not. Good on them, but this is what's happening. You've got the elites telling other people, ordinary Australians, which is the ones they claim to be. There's actually just elites running the show. So I thought that was a pretty good way of describing, or way on the ground seeing what's actually happening. So you sort of put it to them and they say, oh, we're not funded by billionaires, we're not connected to anything else. So I said, well, great, that's cool. Show us who funds you. I mean, you're always having a go at Get-Up, and that was the big thing. Get-Up actually has on its site who funds it. And they, went to Water and said, no, they won't tell me that. So I looked up in, where they were registered to their address, and they share a post office box with someone they've never claimed to, they have no connection to, which is obviously ridiculous, because if you have a post office box, you're both entitled to access the documents. The whole thing's smoke and mirrors and a charade. So
that was interesting, the thing about the the anti-wind farms, because they had a go back in like the 2013-14, and Morris Newman very involved in this then, where they were alleging that the reasons why we shouldn't have wind farms were because of this wind turbine syndrome, which would cause ultrasound, which was making people sick. That failed. So now they've moved on to it's environmentally damaging and it's killing all the whales. But it's the same type of people and the same type of money, Lucy.
And Jeremy Walker, the UTS academic, has pointed out that all the propaganda that they're using is pretty much imported directly from America.
Yeah, right. And one of the things that happens is, Lucy, that you have these organisations, these astroturf organisations that are set up by people like Advance. Then you have the Murdoch press picking up what they're doing. You have studies being produced by the junk tanks.
And the ABC. Can we please just get that in there too? It's not just the Murdoch press. The ABC loves to quote IPA weirdos too.
Well, that's true. And then the ABC always let the Australian newspaper in the morning set the agenda for what they talk about on things like AM. And then Sky News then kind of goes rabid on it at night. So it is this sort of echo chamber, but which legitimises propaganda as news stories. And that's part of the strategy.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And what you've got is, Peter Costello co-founded one of the official Atlas think tanks, and he was 9fax. And in 7, you've got all the mining interests thick on the ground. So there's really nowhere that we're getting, in the mainstream media, that we're getting good information.
And one of the disturbing things that has just happened in the last few weeks is that Australian Digital Holdings, which was the organisation set up by Alan Jones when he got kicked off Sky News and was initially a fairly fringe digital outfit, has now, under the chairmanship of, you guessed it, Maurice Newman, bought the licenses of Southern Cross, the television licenses, which are throughout regional Australia, but also have the news license in Tasmania. So we'll be the organisation. And they are rebranding as well, by the way, as Newsmax, which you may recall, listeners and viewers, is the organisation that was further to the right than Fox News, that caused Fox News actually to start propagating the great lie about 2020 because they were losing too many viewers to Newsmax. So we've got ADH, chaired by Maurice Newman, branding as Newsmax, and now actually getting their hands on some licenses within our capital cities, Lucy.
And for a while there, they had a lot of their partner organisations listed on it, on the website for ADH. And they included several Atlas official think tanks, but they also included One Nation and The Spectator magazine, Epoch Times, which is one of the right-wing media organisations, but also Church and State, which is the Australian conference body that is trying to train Christians to become politically active. And it's in the middle of a big conference tour at the moment.
So poor old Tasmania, because half of their regional papers have also been bought by an organisation called Font PR, which is actually set up by Liberal Party staffers. So this kind of infiltration of media by active political operatives just seems to be running rampant. And there doesn't seem to be anything that ACMA can do to stop it, because that's much more about is local news being presented through these local outlets, and whether or not there's this broad agenda at work seems to be outside their remit. It's kind of extraordinary.
There is a broad agenda at work, and I can say that because late last year I attended the CPAC conference in Brisbane.
Oh my God.
Yeah, right. So that was fun, including they gave me a media pass and it said fake news on it. So, you know, I had to actually chuckle at that. It's pretty funny. But Liz Truss was there, the former UK for 5 minutes Prime Minister, and she said, look, what we need to do is have far more right-wing media, and what that means is vast misinformation media outlets that sort of push propaganda. So that's actually part of the model, and she spoke as though, you know, this is what we're doing and this is our way forward. And it's interesting that in the months following that, we've had all these sort of the more of this pop up. And looking in a recent study in the US, they've sort of plotted out a lot of the, you know, media, and so much of it is this right-wing propaganda. So that's the next thing. It's going to be all these share media sources popping up. And that's sort of in a big way, because you've got, traditionally you have the mainstream media, the large organisations, very much, you know, very tied or very close to the vested interests in some ways, you know, advertising and whatnot. So you've got independent media increasing to growing. So what are you going to do to combat that? Get a whole bunch of, you know, lying outfits essentially that sort of play into that the nonsense hemisphere. So that's something to look out for.
I want to scare everyone just a little bit further, because not only are we having these organizations becoming more prominent and just more a larger factor in our media landscape. I touched on this in the piece this week a little bit. You're having that on this side, but what is also happening is our population is becoming more primed to take this stuff on board and believe it, because we're getting poorer, planet's getting hotter, we're losing democratic rights, and within us that creates this sort of, we're not consciously aware of it, but we feel like we're being ripped off. We feel like something isn't quite right. And instead of going, oh, it's capitalism, we keep bombing the Middle East for oil, we go, oh, it's the trans people. We're just looking for something, and we are more primed to believe nonsense in this environment, which is filled with more nonsense. So this is a feedback loop to doom, really. We really need to do something about this.
Lucy.
The academic Timothy Snyder, who's been writing so much about authoritarianism and is actually now moving to Canada to get out of America because of what's happening with Trump now, he's called it pseudo-populism. So the more you hurt the public, the more power there is for right-wing populists to use. And then that helps the people who fund the politicians who create the pain. So it's just this cycle that the more they hurt us, the more they win.
And it is, of course, enhanced by the online world that we are now so addicted to, and the algorithms which continue to serve up this type of disinformation. And look, the government had a go at a disinformation and misinformation bill, but it was highly flawed, so it wasn't going to get through the Senate, so it had to be shelved. But part of the criticism of that, as I understand it, was that they put back it required the social media companies themselves to be verifying whether the information was accurate or not, at the very time that all of the social media organisations were stepping back from fact-checking and just saying, open slather, go for it. Dave, you wrote about this in a previous article as well.
Sorry, I was just reading the comments. What did I write about?
Oh, Dave. Yeah, I led in so beautifully. You, the way that the social media organisations are not just sort of serving this up, like misinformation up to us via the algorithm, but have also stepped back from fact-checking at the very time that there is this infiltration to deliberately deceive.
100%. And I mean, these are giant corporations that are just trying to maximize their bottom line as well. And if they've got a regulatory environment where they don't need to hire 10,000 people to say that's bullshit, of course they're going to run with that. We should not put our faith in any of these companies.
No. And we don't even have at this stage a truth in advertising during political campaigns. So here we are in the middle of this campaign, and Advance is able to tell lies, although once the election is called, Anthony, there are some constraints on exactly how far they can go, which actually caused a flurry of activity in the lead up to the election being called.
It did, and it's interesting, that particular law. So it's a shame that the government over 3 years didn't bring in, truth in political advertising laws, but here we are.
Which, by the way, we do have in South Australia in the ACT, and have worked very effectively and have not been a dampener on political discussion or freedom of expression. Anthony, sorry.
And for decades too, in Adelaide's, in South Australia's case. So we've got this. So we're stuck with this at the moment. This is where we are. The law comes down to the Australian Electoral Commission. There's a bit of leeway in the law. So how it's been interpreted by the AEC in the past, it's actually illegal to influence someone's vote in a certain way by being dishonest. So that it's generally in that regard. But rather than taking that definition and saying, okay, lies and political advertising are illegal, it's interpreted to say, only after the election's called. So it's not actually a law about the election. That's just how they've interpreted it previously. And they're a bit of a wet lettuce, the AEC. They're in bed with the government of the day a lot of the time. So we don't expect too much action out of them. But there we go. But yes, in terms of just before the election came out, I mean, this was a pretty explicit example. And I think a lot of viewers will recall, you've seen these ads of like independents ripping open their shirt and it says Greens on these, like just absolute lies. David Pocock, for example, did it to him, and the AEC found against them and, gave them a slap on the wrist. But they're still operating, obviously. So about 2 weeks before the election was called, perhaps a week and a half, Simon Fenwick. Now, he had never written to, we get all the emails from Advance that it sends out to its members or people who have decided to put in their email address on their site. And he's given $2.5 million to the organisation since it started in 2018. So he's the biggest funder by far. Basically, he is Advance, like he's paying for it. And he says, this is my first email to you all. We have a very small window of time to hit Albanese hard before the election kicks off. So he's actually specifically saying it. And next week we're going to run these ads and all this and blah, blah, blah. So they know exactly what they're doing. They're playing the AEC for mugs, playing the public for mugs. And there's this perfect example of why we need better laws, or we need laws.
Well, we are in an election campaign, so now would be the time to start raising this with the candidates in your seat. Probably the independents will be the ones who will take this up. They are much more about truth and integrity in the management of our politics than potentially the duopoly of the major parties, which is probably why they're trying to shut them out. Now, we are coming towards the end of the show. Thank you all to our viewers for joining us. Before we go, is there anything specifically Anthony, like a little top tip, something to look out for in the next coming weeks that we haven't touched on yet that you'd like to raise, Anthony?
I just say, just to raise on that point regarding integrity. Last election, it was all about integrity. National Anti-Corruption Commission, where the integrity? Not a peep, not a peep
Yeah.
from the ALP about integrity. So what? Come on, seriously, guys, it's disgusting. And also, they stitched up the voter electoral laws, but just before the election, that are set up to cut out independence in future. So I mean, yeah, that's all I'd say. It's pretty disgraceful.
I think we might dive a bit into that into an interview this week, which I'll come to in a minute. We'll have a slightly different format for next Sunday because it is, of course, Easter Sunday. Lucy, any last comments that you'd like to scare us with some more?
Just watch out for what the Atlas Network partners are doing with church stuff. So you've got the SPay Alliance executive director is now also working with a group called Citizen Go, which is extreme Catholic. It's anti-trans, anti-queer, and abortion abolitionist, from what I can see on its Facebook page. Working under George Christensen, who's leading the body in Australia from an original Spanish extremist organisation. So there's fun ahead for us all.
And I think that is part of the scary and interesting thing, is just how well networked all these organisations are internationally, and they spread the ideas and they spread the money and they spread the influence around. Dave, any last top tips from you?
Not really. Just want to thank our excellent guests for being here. Thanks to our excellent viewers. Thanks, Joe, especially for last week too. And I'm in Free Palestine.
Yeah, and everybody, we're going to do our little YouTube moment. You do have to like us and you do have to subscribe to our channel, because that way we keep the algorithm gods happy. They boost us, all the better for you. If you want us to keep going as well, do think perhaps about a small donation so that we can cover the hard costs associated with this show. Next week, we're not going to have panelists because we figure, let's let our collaborators and contributors have this Easter Sunday in peace, but we will be bringing you some fantastic content. Alex Fine is back to give us her analysis of the midpoint of the campaign, how things are going, which indies are looking good. Has Dutton really dropped the ball entirely? Is there a way back? We think not. Thank you all very much for joining us here on the Sunday Shot. Have a great week, and we look forward to seeing you again next Sunday.
Thank you.
Hidden Dave, I'll bring him back.